Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you, Co-Chairman Merkley, Ranking Member McGovern, Senator Sullivan, Representative Salinas and Zinke. Thank you very much for having me in front of your commission today. I understand that you're interested in my experience of Beijing's transnational repression, or what we also call foreign interference. Like millions of Canadians and Americans, I'm the child of immigrants. My mother immigrated from the Netherlands, and my father immigrated from Hong Kong. I've extended family in both the Netherlands and Hong Kong. I've been elected since 2004 to represent the district of Wellington-Halton Hills, and I've served in the federal cabinet and chaired several parliamentary committees. In 2020, I was appointed the official opposition's shadow minister for foreign affairs. Since then, my criticisms of Beijing have increased in response to President Xi's increasing violations of the rules-based international order and its repression in the PRC and abroad. In November 2020, I introduced a motion adopted by the House of Commons calling on the Canadian government to make a decision on Huawei's involvement in Canada's 5G network within 30 days and to develop a robust plan to combat China's growing foreign operations in Canada and its increasing intimidation of Canadians living in Canada. Several months later, in February, I introduced another motion which the House also adopted, recognizing Beijing's actions towards Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims as a genocide. In May this year, I learned that a PRC diplomat working out of the PRC consulate in Toronto had, since 2020, been gathering information to further target me and my family in Hong Kong. Last month, I learned I was the target of a disinformation campaign in May of this year on the Chinese language social media platform WeChat. The Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs concluded that Beijing's role in this disinformation operation was highly probable. But my experience is but one case of Beijing's interference in Canada. Many, many other cases go unreported and unnoticed, and the victims suffer in silence. This has serious implications for the approximately 4% of Canadians, some 1.7 million Canadians, of Chinese descent. Beijing targets these diaspora groups using a variety of tactics. One tactic is to target the many Chinese international students in Canada, coaching them into participating in foreign interference threat activities on university campuses, such as targeting pro-Hong Kong democracy activists and Tibetan and Uyghur human rights campaigners. Other tactics include targeting Chinese language media and social media in Canada, the establishment of illegal police stations in Canada, the wrongful detention and arrest and detention of Canadians, such as Michael Kovrig, Michael Spavor, and the currently detained Hussein Jalil, whose whereabouts is completely unknown. And another tactic includes coercing Canadians on Canadian soil back to the People's Republic of China. Recently, the PRC has used a tactic of creating wanted lists and offering bounties of the arrest of those from Canada. These various tactics are a serious and concerted effort to interfere with democratic activity in Canada and leave millions of Canadians at risk of being intimidated, coerced, silenced, and unable to enjoy the basic democratic rights and freedoms guaranteed in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in our Constitution. These tactics cannot be tolerated in a free and sovereign country. Canada must work more closely with democratic allies like the United States in countering Beijing's efforts to interfere in our democratic life. Foreign interference is a serious national security threat to Canada. It threatens our economy, our long-term prosperity, social cohesion, our parliament, and our elections. It requires a suite of measures to combat, including closer cooperation amongst allied democracies. Canada must work toward a stronger defense and security partnership with the United States and allies. We must look for every opportunity to strengthen this partnership, to meet the challenge of rising authoritarianism, and to preserve our fundamental freedoms, our democracy, and the rule of law. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chong, for your excellent testimony and for your leadership. Just a couple of questions, and I'll yield to my colleagues for any questions they might have. When you talked about closer cooperation, are you persuaded that we are cooperating now? Is it as robust as it should be? And what is being left undone and unaddressed?
Well, thank you, Chairman Smith, for that question. I think there are a number of ways in which we can cooperate in a better way. So, for example, the United States has long had a Foreign Agents Registry Act since 1938. Australia more recently introduced one, I think in 2019. The UK just adopted one 2 months ago in July. The Government of Canada has announced that it's taking a look at introducing one in Canada to give law enforcement a tool to prosecute Beijing's agents operating on our own soil. And so I think one way in which we could better cooperate is exchange information on legislative best models to see what works and what doesn't. We have similar judicial systems in our democracies. So that's one area of cooperation. Another area, for example, is how do we use sunlight and transparency to counter foreign interference threat activities? Our security agencies and services, our experts have told us that often foreign interference, transnational repression doesn't rise to the level of a criminal prosecution. And so one way to counter it is to make it public, to go public with the intelligence, to tell members of the public, members of Congress, members of Parliament, here's what exactly is going on, to arm citizens and elected officials with the information they need to protect themselves. So best practices on how to do that during elections and between elections. So those are just two examples of where I think we could more closely cooperate.
You know, I mentioned a list of things that had done to people that I know, that we know as a commission, who have been outspoken. I would point out that Anna Kwok, who is here today with us in the back, she has testified in the past here, this year, on behalf of Hong Kong. She has a bounty on her head. I mean, there's no let up by the repressive tactics employed by Xi Jinping. And even Chen Guangzheng, who I worked to help release years ago, they, meaning he assumes it was the Chinese Communist Party, in order to send a message that they were watching, went into his home when he and his wife and family were out and rearranged everything. They didn't destroy anything, they just rearranged it to let him know we've been here. Rabia Kadir, the great Uyghur human rights activist, similarly has had one instance after another. And I'm wondering, you know, looking at you, here you are, a high-profile, member of parliament, and yet they're doing this against you. You know, I was put on the hit list by Global Times a couple of years ago. I was briefed by the FBI. It nowhere nearly comes to what you're going through, believe me. But they said, watch out for social media, watch out for other things that they may do. They refused to give me a visa. I'm trying to put together a trip that would go to Xinjiang after their foreign ministry said, we have nothing to hide. Anybody wants to come, come. We sent a letter to the embassy and said, I want to come. Please approve it. And we have not heard back from them since. But we're going to keep trying. I say this because, you know, the level of angst directed against you, and you have family members at risk, we need to rally behind you and others like you who have family especially. They could do a lot here, but to people in Hong Kong or anywhere else in the PRC, they could do a lot more. So that's why redoubling our efforts, passing this legislation, sharing best practices is so important. You know, in reference to the PRC's disinformation campaign against you on WeChat, could you elaborate what that looked like?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Smith. So what happened with me is that in May of this year, while a big debate was going on in Canada about foreign interference, a number of narratives, false narratives about me popped up on Chinese language social media, particularly on the WeChat platform. And these narratives persisted for about a week, and the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs concluded that they emanated from Chinese Communist Party accounts. This is corrosive because WeChat in Canada has over 1 million users, and some 5 million people globally, including many in Canada, saw that disinformation. And so they have weaponized Chinese language social media, Chinese media, such as CGTN, the state broadcaster. They've weaponized the targeting of radio stations and television stations. I know that in the UK, just a couple of years ago, Ofcom, their broadcast regulator, pulled CGTN off the air, off of television because of human rights violations and disinformation that was being spread. So those are, that's something I think democracies have to grapple with. Best practices on how to do that, I think, is critically important, because one of the things we need to do is we need to balance our fundamental belief in free speech, free expression, free media, freedom of communication with the need to counter this disinformation. Chairman Smith, you also mentioned how the PRC is using money to corrupt our system, and I think that's another area for cooperation. Often transnational repression comes alongside corruption, alongside personal illicit gain, payments of monies or consideration, money laundering, and so I think countering that money laundering, countering the proceeds of illicit gain, I think, is something where democracies also need to work more closely on. And the United States being the world's reserve currency and the US dollar being the main means of transaction in our global economy, I think we can do a lot together to counter this repression that takes in the form of financial corruption.
Before my time runs out, just two things. Is the Canadian government standing very, very in solidarity with you and everyone else? Very briefly on that. And on the college campuses, what is the government doing, not the government, PRC doing vis-a-vis minority religions?
Yes, since the spring, the Canadian government has been standing up and supporting me. I think before that point in time, there were issues that have popped up, but they are now, like many other democracies, reacting to the threat. Like I said, the UK just adopted a foreign agents registry 2 months ago. The Canadian government has announced it will be introducing one. So, democracies are often slow to react to the threat of authoritarian states, which can act much more quickly because it's one person or few people rule. So yes, they have been supportive of me in recent months. On university campuses, what is going on is that there are, I believe, over 100,000 Chinese international students at Canada's leading research universities. Often these students are coached and coerced into participating in foreign interference threat activities on Canadian university campuses. For example, just a couple of years ago, there was a Tibetan human rights activist at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. She had campaigned for President of Student Council. She had won that election, and she was immediately targeted by students through a coordinated effort by the PRC consulate. A similar thing happened at the McMaster University campus in Hamilton, Ontario, where a Uyghur human rights activist was similarly targeted by students through a coordinated action of the PRC consulate. So these are the kinds of coercive activities taking place on university campuses.
Thank you. Co-Chair Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And following up on that impact on university campuses, in your testimony, you note that international students were compelled to demonstrate against pro-Hong Kong rallies after threats were made, quote, to withhold their government scholarships or harm their families back home. In your estimation, this is not just a one-off. This is a systemic strategy to use the Chinese students who are present to essentially create a pro-China force on campuses?
Yes, I think it is a systemic, long-term effort to create fear on university campuses. I just highlighted two examples of what's happened, but we've heard about many other cases on university campuses, and often the Chinese international students who are conducting these activities are themselves being coerced into doing it. Not in all cases, but in many cases. And so, yes, it is a pervasive threat on university campuses.
And I've also read about strategies that China is using in which they essentially recruit some of the Chinese students to spy on other Chinese students who might be participating in critiquing China's policies or participating in protests against Chinese activities in Hong Kong or against Uyghurs and so forth. Is that something that you've observed in Canada as well?
Yes, we have observed that. At our committee in the House of Commons, we heard testimony from witnesses who highlighted exactly that going on, that these students were being coerced into spying on other students, threatening other students from the PRC who weren't towing the PRC line, and doing so under threat of having their scholarships withdrawn or their family targeted back home.
Is there an effort to establish a channel through which students can report these strategies of coercion so we can get a better grip on how widespread it is and ponder ways to address it?
Well, there is a center that Canadians can call to report foreign interference threat activities, but I don't think it's broadly made available to Chinese international students or promoted amongst that community. Again, it's an area where we could learn from each other on best practices on how to counter this threat, and where I think allied democracies can learn from each other on how to counter this.
Also I'll shift gears here from the campuses, and thank you for those insights. You note in your testimony that there's significant influence in Mandarin language news outlets. And, I would have thought that often those news outlets in our democracies would be a place that would kind of particularly be interested in reporting on China's abuses, but they're being co-opted. What is the strategy being employed there? Why is it effective?
Well, I think the strategy is multi-pronged. So, for example, there are state broadcasters from the PRC that are on the airwaves in democracies, such as CGTN, the PRC state broadcaster. It often promotes the propaganda right out of the Chinese Communist Party, and those broadcasts are seen by millions of people around the world. They often, people close to the Chinese Communist Party leadership have often taken ownership of newspapers and radio stations, and we've noticed that there's been a shift in the editorial stance of those newspapers. So, for example, Tsingtao Daily is the largest Chinese language newspaper in Canada. Its former editor is Victor Ho, and he has told us in testimony in front of our committee that the newspaper is largely now a vehicle for Chinese Communist Party propaganda and views, compared to when he was the editor, where it was truly an independent newspaper that operated freely of any control from Beijing.
I think that's a really important point. But is it the Chinese government that's buying these outlets? Is it Chinese corporations or affluent Chinese individuals? How are they securing ownership control?
It's not directly owned by the state. These are individuals, these are assets that have been purchased by individuals that are close to the PRC. For example, we've seen recently that a couple of years ago that the South China Morning Post, the largest English language newspaper in Hong Kong, changed ownership. And there are suggestions that its editorial stance has changed because of that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I want to close with the question as to whether any of your family back in China have ever been threatened as a result of your conversations.
Well, my experience is, I think, illustrative of what is happening to many Canadians and Americans and other citizens of other democracies. Out of an abundance of caution, I've cut off contact with my family in Hong Kong in order to ensure that they are somewhat insulated from the work that I'm doing here. And I know, in talking to members of diaspora communities across Canada and in the United States, that many other people have done the same thing. And so this is the consequence, one of the consequences of the PRC's transnational repression.
Thanks so much.
Senator Sullivan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Minister, welcome, and thank you again for your courage for being here. What you're doing, even as we speak, in terms of your testimony, takes an enormous amount of courage, and I just want to let you know how much we admire it and appreciate it, because it takes people like you to speak out, even though you do so with threats and risks to your family. So really appreciate that. I want to just touch on a couple points that I raised in my opening statement, but your point about sticking together democracies, can you expand on this a little bit more, particularly in light of the fact that we've seen the Chinese Communist Party's strategy is to often try to isolate and single out certain democracies. You know, they were really, really pounding Lithuania from an economic standpoint. Australia, they undertook this big coercive economic, essentially blockade. And can you tell just a little bit more on how important it is for all of us as democracies to push back together, stick together, and that brings us power and strength, particularly when they try to pick off smaller countries, which I know is part of their strategy?
Well, thank you, Senator, for that question. I mentioned how we can work more closely together on translating intelligence into public disclosure.
Yeah.
Our members of the public have talked a bit about, working together to figure out how do we counter disinformation during targeting elected officials and our elections while still upholding fundamental freedoms of free speech. Foreign agent registry is another area for cooperation. Talked a bit about how we can cooperate on transnational financial crimes, which often come alongside foreign interference. But another area for cooperation is combating repression within the People's Republic of China. For example, we know that much of the cotton and many of the tomatoes produced in Xinjiang province in Western China are being produced through the forced labor of Uyghurs.
Yeah.
And we know that those products are being exported around the world. I think the United States has done an excellent job in enforcing bans on the importation of products like tomatoes and cotton that have been produced using that forced labor. As I understand it, some 2,500 shipments from the PRC in the last 2 or 3 years have been seized by U.S. border officials and prevented from coming into the United States. In Canada, we've yet to seize one shipment. There was a single shipment that was seized but later released. We have evidence that those products continue to flow into Canada, and I think that's an area where we should learn from U.S. best practices on stopping these products from coming into our country. We're part of a North American free trade zone. We can't be the place where these products have a backdoor to come in. So that is another example of where I think we could work much more closely with a democracy like the United States to learn on how to implement these sorts of bans.
Thank you. Let me follow up on your points on transparency, working together. I also believe it's important, particularly for regimes like this that, often only recognize power and threats to their own viability. As you know, the Chinese Communist Party's #1 goal is to stay in power, way above anything else. The welfare of their people, they could care less, as long as they stay in power. So here's another question I have for you. I also think it's important we go on a little bit of offense, right? Covertly, overtly, collectively, a lot of the CCP leadership we know is corrupt. We know they steal from their own people. We know that they're very rich from their corruption. Don't you think it makes sense, particularly like I'm saying, as the Chinese are trying to sow discord, literally as people in Hawaii are burying our fellow Americans? Just outrageous. That we should also go on offense, let the Chinese people know how corrupt their leaders are, that they're all very rich because they steal from their people. Don't you think we should be going on offense, covertly, overtly? You want to mess with us? Okay, we'll mess with you. Then maybe we'll bring your leadership down. Don't you think we should be doing that?
Well, I think that's a very good point you make, Senator. I think of past decades before the rise of the internet and modern communication technologies, where shortwave radio was often used as a way to ensure that people in authoritarian states were receiving news and information that wasn't the propaganda of the state. And I think in this day and age, we should be funding VPN technologies that will allow people behind great firewalls like the one in the PRC to access news and information from the outside world.
Yeah.
So that they actually get the truth rather than propaganda.
Well, I think it's also very true, and I'm sure you would agree, that Xi Jinping's biggest weakness is that he fears his own people. That's why he's killing all of his close associates, or at least disappearing them. I don't know where they are. They're probably dead. Let me get back to this issue of the nature of the regime, because I think you understand it more than most. But it's often right in front of our faces, and we don't want to recognize it. Let me give you a broader example. You know, it's really interesting to me that you read Xi Jinping's speeches, you watch what he says publicly, you look at who he emulates. The guy emulates Mao Zedong, right? There's no doubt about it. He's trying to model himself on Mao Zedong. If you just do a little bit of reading of the history of Mao Zedong, he's one of the most brutal dictators in the history, maybe of the world. The Black Book of Communism estimates that he killed probably 50 to 60 million of his own citizens. And the current leader of China emulates him. That would be like the Chancellor of Germany emulating Hitler. So what does it say about the nature of the regime that the current leader of China emulates one of the most brutal dictators in the history of the world? Shouldn't we be concerned about that? But shouldn't it also be a lesson for us?
Yeah, I think it should be of concern to us. I think the rising prosperity of authoritarian states, such as the People's Republic of China over the last 20 years, has given them the resources to export their model of authoritarianism around the world, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think we as democracies need to acknowledge that this is a very real threat. And I think we have slowly come to this realization over the last decade. You know, I think beyond 10 years ago, I think we wrongly assumed that along with increasing prosperity in these authoritarian states, that they would gradually improve their record on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. But the opposite has happened. All they have done is taken this newfound wealth and reinforced this authoritarianism using technology, using other methods to repress their people. But going back to an earlier point you made about sunlight and transparency and disclosure, one of the things that we are based on is freedom of speech, freedom of expression, a belief in transparency and sunlight. That is not something authoritarian states are based on. They're based on the very opposite principle. So I think by naming and shaming bad actors, by using intelligence and making some of that public to name and shame bad actors, I think we'll go a long way in countering this threat.
Great, thank you. Thanks again for your courage, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again, sir.
I'd like to now yield to the ranking member, Jim McGovern.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for being here. You know, the concern that is not just about social media outlets that China can control or has a greater influence on. I mean, you know, I just plugged in to Twitter Maui fire causes, and things come up like from the Desert Review, whatever the hell that is. I have no idea, but basically. These are it echoes the stuff that China's been putting out, you know, that somehow there's some mysterious causes to these fires. There's a number of posts. I mean, it doesn't say Chinese government posted them. I mean, they obviously have sympathizers and people who promote conspiracy theories. But we have a problem, again, as a country that believes in free speech, and freedom of expression. I mean, we have a problem on our own social media platforms with disinformation being put out there. And in the case of Twitter, now X, I mean, all the kind of review procedures that used to be in place are gone. I mean, we're reading about, you know, the attacks on the Anti-Defamation League that were raising issues about anti-Semitic posts that were being placed online, and the response to really try to destroy the integrity of the ADL is really quite, you know, stunning. And so it's a, how do you get these social media platform executives who oversee this to actually be more responsible? And so it's not just about naming and shaming the Chinese government, which we ought to do because of what they're doing, but we have corporate leaders that tolerate this, in countries like ours. I mean, how do you get it? Do we name and shame them a little bit more?
Well, Representative McGovern, that's an excellent question. And this is where I think like-minded democracies could really learn from each other on best practices and different models. So, for example, the European Union has a model to counter disinformation. The European Commission has set up a unit within the EC to counter disinformation in real time that's springing up on social media platforms. On the other hand, a very different model is the Taiwanese model. Taiwan is ground zero for the PRC's disinformation operations. Both the PRC and Taiwan share a common language. And so they are ground zero for this disinformation. And they've taken a very different approach. I was recently part of a delegation to Taiwan where I met with Audrey Tang, who's the minister, the new inaugural Minister of Digital Affairs. And she told me about their policy, which is a very different approach. It's grounded in resiliency, it's grounded in the education system, the primary and high school education system, and in civil society, empowering civil society groups to counter this disinformation. So this is where I think we can learn from each other on best practices, on what works, what doesn't. At the end of the day, we have to balance two competing things. One is to counter this disinformation while upholding freedom of the media and freedom of speech.
Yeah, I mean, and the level of disinformation that is being peddled on various social media platforms, I really think undercuts our democracy and our very freedoms that we care about. And it's always frustrating to me that we can't seem to come to a consensus on what disinformation is. And so we don't want to be in the business of censorship, but there ought to be some mechanism that clearly calls out lies and disinformation and conspiracy theories and attacks on individuals, even if they're very subtle, for what they are. And so I think we this is a real challenge that some of it is putting pressure on China. Some of it is putting pressure on the platforms that allow people to traffic these lies and these threats on. The other thing, I mean, as I said in the beginning, I'm worried about attacks against people on these various platforms, but I am also, quite frankly, very worried about the other forms of transnational repression, including assassinations, illegal deportations, abductions, and family intimidation and Interpol abuse. I mean, the potential for the abuse of Interpol is well known and long-standing. I mean, do you have any specific recommendations for reform of the Interpol system to combat transnational repression?
Well, I think we do need to take a look at reforming Interpol in light of the bounties and demand for arrest of 8 pro-Hong Kong democracy activists who are abroad. I think we've got to make sure that Interpol isn't used as a tool by the PRC to arrest and detain these individuals. I think of a Canadian, Hussein Jalil, who was wrongfully arrested in outside of the PRC, I believe in Turkmenistan, a number of years ago, and then extradited to the PRC, and his whereabouts is completely unknown. And the PRC won't tell the Canadian government where he is being detained or even if he is alive. And his wife and children live in Burlington, Ontario, just a couple miles up from north of the border, north of New York State. And it's so corrosive, that kind of tactic, because it sends a message to the rest of the community in Canada. If they dare to speak up, if they dare to stand up, they may be arrested abroad and taken to the PRC.
Yeah, well, I think we need to do a better job of coordinating with other like-minded countries, that when another country has somebody who is seeking asylum and yet China has a particular hold over the country where that person may be seeking refuge and are thinking of deporting him or her back to China. I mean, we ought to be more coordinated in our efforts to try to provide a circle of protection around those individuals. But this is an important topic, and the abuse of these various platforms to target people, to discredit people, to spread conspiracy theories, I mean, is proliferated in a way that I don't think any of us could have imagined when social media first came into being. And I mean, it's hard to figure out how to put the genie back in the bottle, but we need, and maybe the counteroffensive that we're, are more truth tellers trying to influence on social media, and we need to, maybe we need to try to establish a group of people to set the record straight. But again, I just thought it was interesting when I Googled, Maui fires. When I plugged it in on Twitter, two conspiracy theories appear, both that are being peddled by the Chinese government. But I appreciate your courage, and I appreciate your advocacy, and I look forward to working with you in the months ahead. I yield back.
Commissioner Zinke?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.